So issues and debates, this is for the compulsory section of your paper 3. This will be your section A. And you have to be aware about the issues within psychology and the debates within psychology. So what do you need to know? You need to know about gender and culture bias, free will and determinism, the nature-nurture debate, holism versus reductionism, and the idiographic and nomothetic approaches and ethical implications of research, including socially sensitive research. You will be expected to give examples across topics. Okay, so think back to your year 1 stuff and your paper 1 and paper 2 stuff, as well as the sections that you learn in paper 3. So gender bias is when psychological research or theory may offer a view that is not representative of the experiences of both men and women. This differential treatment or representation of men and women is usually based on stereotypes rather than any real differences. So the idea that men are better at spatial awareness and map reading and women are better at reading emotions or multitasking. Universality. This means that all research is assumed to apply equally to both genders. It's the idea that there is no differences between males and females. The behaviour that is found in one gender is true for the other. Androcentrism. So you need to be aware of this key word. Androcentrism is when theories tend to represent a male view of the world or worldview, and this is a result of psychologists being predominantly male. It can result in both alpha or beta bias. So beta bias is when gender differences are exaggerated, and this leads to a misrepresentation of behaviour that exaggerates the differences between males and females. Also, some theories have been used to devalue women. So an example would be Freud and his psychoanalyst or his psychodynamic theory. So Freud believed that femininity was failed masculinity, and he exaggerated the differences between males and females. Beta bias is where you minimise the gender differences. And this is when there is a misrepresentation of behaviour that minimises the differences between males and females. Studies that only use men or women and then suggest that the findings can be applied to both genders are beta bias. So think back to social influences. So you had Milgram, Ash, Zimbardo only using male samples, Moscovici only using female samples. They would be beta bias. Another example would be the fight or flight stress response. So biological research is usually conducted on male animals because it's easier to study the effects of testosterone, because the females, the variation of hormone levels makes it difficult to test. It is assumed that male-only samples wouldn't matter because what is true for males is also true for females. However, there are biological differences, so that might not be the case. So then let's look at the discussion element. So is psychology gender bias or isn't it? So feminists argue that gender bias can be avoided, so psychology doesn't need to be gender bias. Worrell suggests criteria that researchers can follow in order to avoid gender bias, and women should be studied within a meaningful real-life context. However, we have got some arguments against psychology and saying that it is gender bias. So gender-based research can create misleading assumptions about female behaviour and fail to challenge the negative stereotypes. Gender bias in research which affects the lives and prospects of real women. So for example, the statistic that females are around twice as likely to be diagnosed with depression in comparison to males. The method that is used during psychology and how women are observed and tested is different. So it was found that male experimenters are more pleasant and friendly and encouraging to female participants than male participants. The results was that the male participants performed less well on the tasks they were assigned. So psychology is gender bias. Another important aspect is that there is a problem within psychology of the issue of a lack of women appointed to senior research levels. So that means that female concerns or issues might not be reflected in the research questions being asked in the first place. Male researchers are more likely to get their work published and studies which find evidence of gender differences are more likely to appear in journal articles. This means that psychology may be guilty of supporting a form of institutional sexism that creates biases in theories and research. Okay, you need to be aware about culture bias. This is the tendency to judge all people in terms of your own cultural assumptions. This distorts or biases your judgment. So you have ethnocentrism. So this is the belief in the superiority of one's own cultural group. So you think that your culture is superior in comparison to other cultures. So an example of this would be The Strange Situation by Ainsworth. This demonstrated the norms and the values of American culture and based their ideal attachment type of secure based on those norms and values. Child-rearing practices in other cultures were seen as to deviate from the norm. For example, German mothers were seen as cold and rejecting rather than encouraging independence in their children. So we have this idea of ethnocentrism. You need to be aware about cultural relativism. So all cultures are worthy of respect, and that in studying other cultures we need to try and understand the way that that particular culture sees the world. So Berry drew distinctions culturally between etic and emic approaches. So imposed ethics, so if we go back to Ainsworth's study, whereby behaviour from the outside of a particular culture are then described to those behaviours as universal. So Ainsworth's study has imposed ethic. She created the types of attachment and used those American norms and values of that culture to apply them to other cultures. If you think about Jehoda's criteria for ideal mental health, that would be imposed ethics. She is creating the ideal mental health on Western viewpoints. Emic is where behaviour within or inside of a particular culture and certain behaviours are said to be only specific to that culture. So you're saying that that behaviour is only applicable to that culture. You need to be aware about universality in terms of culture bias. Psychology has ignored culture as an important influence on human behaviour and has assumed that findings from Western cultures can be applied to all over the world. So Ash and Milgram, their studies on conformity and obedience were originally conducted in the US and with American participants. However, when they were replicated in other parts of the world, very different results were found. So we might not have that universality of findings. So again, the discussion. So critics have argued that the simplistic distinction between cultures is no longer applicable. Individualistic cultures are generally associated with Western cultures and collectivist cultures associated with India and China, so non-Western cultures. However, studies have found there is no distinct difference between the US and Japan between individualism and collectivism, and perhaps suggest that culture bias in research is less of an issue than it once was. So this is saying that psychology isn't gender bias. Also, research in psychology researchers travel a lot more than what they did 50 years ago, and therefore they have an increased understanding of different cultures. This increased understanding is on a professional and personal level, with academics attending conferences in different countries and cultures who meet regularly to discuss and exchange ideas. So again, psychology might not be as culturally biased as it once was. However, we need to be aware there are some very negative consequences of culture bias. An example of damage done would be the US Army IQ test before the First World War. The test showed that European immigrants fell slightly below white Americans in terms of their IQ, and African Americans were at the bottom of the scale with the lowest mental age. This led to enduring stereotypes about certain ethnic groups and their IQs as attitudes held by the Americans towards certain groups of people, so towards black people and people of southeastern Europe. However, the IQ test was testing them on American norms and values and culture. It wasn't a true representation of IQ. So moving on to the debate section then, so free will and determinism. So free will is the idea that humans can make choices and are not controlled by biological or external forces. So this implies that behaviour has no cause, it's unpredictable and random. The lack of an authorised definition of free will means that it cannot be tested scientifically, and that without precise definitions, research is vague and replication is impossible. Whereas determinism is the view that an individual's behaviour is shaped or controlled by either an internal or external force, rather than the individual's own free choice to do it. You have different types of determinism that you need to be aware about. So environmental determinism is when behaviour is under the control of features in the external environment, such as reinforcement and punishment. So for example, the behaviourist approach sees behaviour as a product of reinforcements and punishments, so stimulus and responses. The biological determinism, behaviour is under the control of hormones, brain activity and genetics. So it's within the person, internal factors. For example, mental illnesses such as depression are caused by low levels of serotonin. Psychic determinism is the idea that thoughts and feelings are determined by life and death instincts and repressed conflicts. So think back to the psychodynamic approach. You also have hard and soft determinism. So hard determinism is behaviour is caused by events entirely outside of the person's control. So according to this view, behaviour should be predictable and determined. We should actually be able to predict someone's behaviour based on these events or factors. Soft determinism recognises that people do have a choice. So some of the behaviour is determined and will be predictable, but humans do have an element of free choice. You also need to be aware about, within this topic, the scientific emphasis on causal explanations. So the basis of the principles of science is that every event in the universe has a cause, and that cause can be explained by creating a general law. The knowledge of the causes and the formulation of the laws are important, as they allow scientists or psychologists to predict and control events in the future. So if we know the causes and a law for behaviour, then we should be accurately able to predict someone's behaviour and control that behaviour in the future, or treat it. So moving on to the discussion then. So is psychology free will, or is our behaviour determined? So the idea of free will has been supported by everyday experiences. So we generally have the impression that we do have free will through our choices. It has face validity because it makes sense. Research suggests that people who have an internal locus of believing that they have a high degree over their influence of their behaviour and events tend to be more mentally healthy. So the idea of free will is actually beneficial to our mental health. However, some research suggests that we don't have free will. Neurological studies of decision making have revealed that the brain activity that determined the outcome of a simple choices may predate our knowledge of having made such a choice. So actually, we don't have free will. Our brain has already made that decision before we think that we have made that free will to make the choice. So for the idea that psychology is deterministic then, so determinism is consistent with the aims of science. The idea that human behaviour is orderly and obeys laws place everyday psychology as an equal footing with more established science. So it's led to the development of treatments, therapies and behavioural interventions that may benefit people. For example, if we know that schizophrenia may be a result of high levels of dopamine, we can put treatments in that will lower the levels of dopamine. The hard determinist stance that the individual choice is not cause of behaviour is not consistent with the way in which our legal system operates. in a law of court, offenders are held morally accountable for their actions. Also, determinism as an approach is unfalsifiable, so this is an issue with determinism. It is based on the idea that causes of behaviour will always exist, even though they may not have been found. As a basic principle, it is impossible to prove wrong. It suggests that the deterministic approach to human behaviour may not be as scientific as it first seemed. The nature-nurture debate. Nature is the idea that behaviour is a product of innate factors such as biological or genetic influences. The genetic explanation, say family, twin and adoption studies, shows that the closer the two individuals are genetically, the more likely that both of them will develop the same behaviour. So think of the concordance rates for lots of mental illnesses that we have looked at. Evolutionary explanation. This is based on the principle that behaviour or characteristics that promote survival and reproduction will be naturally selected. This is a result of behaviours and characteristics that are adaptive, and the genes for those behaviours and characteristics will be passed on through future generations. Nurture assumes that behaviour is a product of environmental influences. Behaviourism assumes that behaviour can be explained in terms of experience alone. So behaviourists suggest that attachment could be explained in terms of classical conditioning, so the person that feeds them, and operant conditioning, food reduces hunger and therefore is rewarding. So we develop attachment through learning theory. Social learning theory also takes the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. So Bandura believed behaviour was due to vicarious reinforcement, but he did also accept that biology has a role, as in sometimes people have the urge to behave aggressively, might be biological, but if that person learns to express that anger, it is through the environmental influences, so through direct and indirect reinforcement. So a way we could overcome this is to take the interactionist approach. This is the idea that nature and nurture are linked to an extent that it doesn't make sense to separate them. So the two are researched together and see how they interact and influence one another. So if we look at Maguire, this we looked at when we did biopsychology. So structural MRI scans of the brains of licensed taxi drivers were compared with controls who were not taxi drivers. It was found that the hippocampal volume correlated with the amount of time spent as a taxi driver, so it appears the brain has a capacity for plasticity. The structure of the brain can be altered in response to environmental demands. We could also talk about schizophrenia here with the interactionist approach. So, there are practical applications for the nature side of the debate. For example, drug therapies can be developed to treat behavioural and psychological problems that have a physiological origin. So SSRIs have been used to treat depression because it's been suggested that depression is linked to low levels of serotonin, and SSRIs increase the level of serotonin within the synapse, therefore that should reduce the symptoms of depression. Also, there are practical applications for the nurture side of the debate. For example, if behaviour is susceptible to environmental influences, we need to consider how we adapt to our environment. So, how can we plan intervention for criminal behaviour and reduce aggression? If we learn aggression through observation and watching violent TV and video games, we might need to put in practices to reduce the amount of violence that is shown towards programs aimed at children. However, it is difficult to separate nature and nurture as one influences the other. So, for example, there's an inherited disorder known as PKU, which causes brain damage as a baby. However, if the condition is detected at birth and the infant is given a restricted diet, which then prevents brain damage. So we can see how it's inherited, so there is a nature side of it, but through nurture environmental influences we can reduce or prevent it. The nature-nurture debate is reductionist and deterministic. So for example, the nature side of the debate suggests that we are premeditated to develop behaviours from birth and ignores the idea of free will, as it does not take into account any environment in its explanation, so therefore makes it reductionist. Equally, the nurture debate is reductionist as it suggests that all the behaviours are a result of the environment, therefore ignoring any nature or genetics. Also, research attempting to separate the influence of the environment is complicated by the fact siblings are raised within the same family and may not have experienced the same upbringing. The idea of shared and unshared environments suggests that individual differences means that siblings may experience life differently. For example, age and temperament to a particular life event, such as a divorce, may have different meanings to different siblings. This would explain the findings that MZ twins reared together do not show a perfect concordance rate. Holism and Reductionism. Holism is the idea that behaviour such as memory or a mental disorder should be perceived via the whole experience rather than individual features. Humanistic psychology takes a holistic approach, so they believe that individual reacts as an organised whole rather than a set of stimulus-response links. So what matters is a person's sense of unified identity. They should be viewed as a whole. Also, cognitive psychologists may argue that memory is a complex system which is understood through connectionist networks. And they're described as holistic because the networks are part of the whole behave differently than when they are studied as individual parts. Reductionism is the idea that the approach breaks down complex phenomena into more simple components, implying that it is desirable because complex phenomena are best understood in terms of a simpler level of explanation. So we have biological reductionism, which attempts to explain social and psychological phenomena at a lower biological level, so in terms of the actions of genes and hormones. So, for example, the effects of psychoactive drugs on the brain have contributed to our understanding of neural processes and how it's possible to explain serious mental disorders such as OCD, depression, and schizophrenia. Environmental reductionism explains all behaviour in terms of a stimulus-response link that we have learned through experiences. So, for example, the behaviourist approach is built upon the environmental reductionism, as they study only observable behaviour through learning, which is broken down into a stimulus response, so classical conditioning. You need to be aware about the 3 levels of measurement. So the highest level, cultural and social explanations of how our social group affects our behaviour. So memory can be explained at a social level in how cultural expectations affect what we remember. The middle level is psychological explanations of behaviour, so memory can be explained at the psychological level in terms of episodic memories, so memories that are of our personal events. And the lowest level is biological explanation, so how hormones, genes, brain structure affect our behaviour. So memory, again, can be explained at this level in terms of the areas of the brain where memories are stored and the neurotransmitters that are involved in forming memories. So discussion for holism, so the idea that we should be holistic, is that it provides a more complete and global understanding of behaviour rather than the reductionist approaches. So, for example, the effects of conformity to social roles and de-individuation of the prisoners and the prison guards within the Stanford Prison Experiment could not be understood simply by studying the individuals alone. It is better by studying the whole effects of the individuals, the situation, and the uniforms that they were in. Moving on to reductionism then, so for reductionism, an explanation can be tested as there are fewer factors to consider. So this means that empirical work can be conducted on an explanation and it gives it academic weight, so it makes it more scientific. Also, it can help facilitate the development of biological therapies such as drug treatments, which do help people when suffering mental health problems. So think about your antipsychotic drugs in schizophrenia, your anti-anxiety drugs, so BZs, SSRIs for OCD. Other explanations are ignored or underplayed. So in the case of mental illnesses, it could lead to a relapse or a reoccurrence of the issue. because all of the factors hadn't been considered. So it might not simply be down to a biological component, there could also be environmental aspects that could be having an impact that haven't been considered. Also, the complexity involved in every behaviour means that a purely reductionist explanation is rarely accepted as sufficient. Moving on to idiographic and nomothetic. Remember, idiographic begins with an I, it's looking at the individual. So it attempts to describe the nature of the individual. People are studied as unique entities, each with their own subjective experiences, motivations and values. There is no attempt to compare the individuals to a larger group, standard or a norm. It is generally associated with methods in psychology that produce qualitative data, such as case studies, unstructured interviews and other self-report techniques. One of the central aims of the idiographic research is to describe the richness of human experience and gain insight into a person's unique way of viewing the world. So 2 examples then are the humanistic and psychodynamic approach. The humanistic approach are only interested in documenting the conscious experience of the individual or their self. So they describe themselves as anti-scientific. Humanistic psychologists are more concerned with investigating unique experiences on its own rather than producing general laws about behaviour. The psychodynamic approach can also be described as idiographic through the use of the case study method, which details the lives of the patients. However, it does contain a bit of nomothetic approach because it did create universal laws about behaviour and personality development. So for example, the idea of the id, ego, superego and the psychosexual stages are applied to all humans. So the nomothetic approach aims to produce a general law about human behaviour. They provide a benchmark which people can be compared, measured and classified against. And the likelihood of future behaviour can be predicted, so we can say this is what's going to happen, and can be controlled or treated. They use methods which would be considered as scientific and generally gather quantitative data. These involve the study of generally larger number of people, so a larger sample size, in order to establish ways in which people are similar. So, behaviourists take the nomothetic approach. The study of hundreds of rats, cats and pigeons and dogs have been used to develop laws of learning. So Pavlov's and his dogs with classical conditioning, Skinner with his rats and pigeons in operant conditioning. The cognitive approach, so psychologists have been able to infer the structure and process of human memory by measuring the performance of large samples of people within lab experiments, and then they've been applied to all humans. Also, biological psychologists have conducted brain scans on countless human brains in order to make generalizations about the localization and functions. So, the general law that the language centers are located in the left hemisphere of the brain. Moving on to discussion then. Idiographic, so for idiographic, the use of qualitative methods provides an in-depth and arguably more complete account of the individual compared to the nomothetic approach. However, they offer a very narrow perspective because the ideas may struggle to be generalised beyond the individual study, so it reduces the ecological validity. Also, the methods used often lack scientific rigour as they rely on subjective interpretation. So it means that the conclusions are open to bias and they might not be valid. The nomothetic approach though, so we can switch these around, the one that was the weakness of the idiographic become the strength of the nomothetic. So the strength of the nomothetic approach is that the methods used are very scientific. It's important as it increases the internal validity of the results, and it means the results and conclusions are not influenced by researcher bias. Also, another strength, or the argument for the nomothetic approach, is that it enables psychologists to establish general laws which can be used for comparison, prediction and even control future behaviour. So for example, it can be used to predict the impact of a certain treatment for people suffering from a psychological illness. However, an argument against the nomothetic approach is that it overlooks the richness of human behaviour, which many argue is crucial when trying to understand human behaviour. It could be that human behaviour is too complex to establish general laws, and people have to be seen as an individual. So ethical issues and socially sensitive research. Ethical implications, so that is the impact of psychological research, which may have in terms of the rights of other people, especially participants. Socially sensitive research is any research that might have a direct social consequence for participants in the research or a group that they represent. So the research process can lead to ethical issues and socially sensitive research. So the research question, so some questions can be damaging to members of a particular group. So is homosexuality inherited? That would be socially sensitive to a whole group. The conduct of the research and treatment of participants. So remember, they need to be confidential information that is collected. So if a participant confesses to a crime, though, should confidentiality be maintained? The institutional context of the research. So research may be funded by a private institution that may misuse the data. Also, the interpretation and application of findings. So research findings may not be used for the purpose they're originally intended for. So think back to the IQ test that we mentioned earlier, that used to demonstrate the inferiority of certain groups, and they were then sterilised within the USA in the 20th century. Ethical issues then in socially sensitive research. So privacy. So more information could be taken and used to inform social policy. Confidentiality. Participants may be less willing to divulge information in the future if confidentiality is breached, and further research would be compromised. Valid methodology. Studies with poor methodology may shape important social policies. Deception. Research may lead to people to form untrue stereotypes. Informed consent. Participants may not always comprehend what is involved in the research. Equitable treatment. So all participants should be treated in the same manner. And scientific freedom. Scientists have a duty to engage in research, but has an obligation not to harm participants. So discussion. There are guidelines that are very stringent that are in place to protect the participants, so people who are involved in the research process. The guidelines have become more careful as time has passed on, so chances of the research causing problems has been reduced. Sometimes it's not possible to see the effects that the research might have on the researcher, the participants, or the social group, so it makes it hard to judge. It's not an objective decision. There are potential biases from within the decision maker, so it makes it difficult, and it means that socially sensitive research can still cause problems from time to time. However, we need to be careful about the wider impact of the research. There's always social consequences to participation in research, but with socially sensitive research, there's also increased potential for more indirect impact on the participant's family. It is not sufficient to safeguard the interests of the individual. You must consider the likely impact the research has on the larger groups. It also may disadvantage marginalised groups. Many groups in society have suffered from the consequences of having been excluded from research or being misrepresented when they have been included. The failure to accurately represent the research these groups carries with it additional ethical issues. The fact that these groups have missed out on any potential benefits of the research. So think about relationships. A lot of research is carried out on heterosexual relationships. Homosexual relationships are generally understudied, so they may have missed out on potential benefits of researching homosexual relationships. Also, ethical guidelines set out for the research permission are seen by some as being too strict. There are areas of research which could elicit helpful findings and could benefit a lot of people. However, research cannot be conducted due to the research process potentially causing issues for the participant. So reaching a balance is therefore problematic.